Jay, last 24 hours have been, in my opinion, some of the most momentous and important in the conflict in Ukraine, and they are made so both by a whole series of events on the battlefronts and in terms of the Russian military industrial complex and Western decision making, but also because of some very, very interesting and important news provided to us by the Russians about their long-term intentions. And this information comes in a series of interviews given by President Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov, which have attracted a certain amount of attention in the West, but in my opinion, people in the West, people in the commentary community, have missed some of the more important points, perhaps, that Peskov has made. Anyway, let's first turn to what the Russian news agency TASS is telling us that Peskov has said, and I should stress there's been several statements, there's several reports about this on TASS. TASS, of course, is Russia's official news agency. But anyway, this is the first report published early this morning. Some Russian territories are currently de facto occupied by the Kiev regime. It is necessary to liberate the new regions and to protect the people there, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said in an interview for AIF-RU, it's an internet newspaper. We now have 4 new federation subjects, and the most important thing for us is to protect the people in these territories and to liberate the territory of these subjects, which is de facto occupied by the Kiev regime. And then we get the most important part of this TASS report. The Kremlin spokesman also noted that Russia cannot allow the existence of a state that has documented its intention to use any necessary means to take Crimea, not to mention Donbass and Novorossiya on its doorstep. Now, let's just unpack those words. Firstly, Peskov is telling us that the Russians, as a matter of military priority, intend to liberate all the territory which they consider theirs and which they consider is currently occupied by what Peskov calls the Kiev regime, in other words, by the Ukrainian authorities. And that means, obviously, the whole of Donbass, all of it, the whole of Zaporozhye region, including the city of Zaporozhye, one of Ukraine's key industrial centers, and also Kherson region on the west bank of the Dnieper River. So Peskov is making it absolutely clear that as far as the Russians are concerned, the ultimate objective of the war, one of the ultimate objectives of the war, is to bring all of these territories, including the city of Zaporozhye, including Kherson city on the west bank of the Dnieper River, including the whole of Kherson region, to bring them back under the control of Russia, because the Russians consider these territories to be now part of Russian state territory. Well, that is ominous for the Ukrainians. It shows that the Russians fully intend to capture Zaporozhye and Kherson city and the rest of Donbass, that all discussions and commentaries in the West that the Russians might be persuaded to accept what they already have, the 20% of territory, former Ukrainian territory, that they already control. Well, Peskov has said that this is wrong. The Russians at the very least, intend to bring under their control all of the territory in the four regions, within the four oblasts that make up the four regions: Donbass, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, which became part of Russia, so far as the Russians are concerned, in September 2022. So that is a minimum objective. But consider the other point that Peskov is making. And again, I go back to TASS. The Kremlin spokesman also noted that Russia cannot allow the existence of a state that has documented its intention to use any means necessary to take Crimea, not to mention Donbass and Novorossiya on its doorstep. Novorossiya, I should say, means Zaporozhye and Kherson region. This is now the official formal title that the Russians appear to be moving towards adopting in connection with those two oblasts. Now, just take a step back and think what Peskov is saying here. He is saying that Russia cannot allow the existence of a state that has made clear its intention to use any necessary means to take back Crimea, as well as Donbass and Novorossiya. So at the minimum, that tells us that the Russians now are straightforwardly aiming for regime change in Kiev, because the current Ukrainian government, the government of Volodymyr Zelensky, the government structures that were created since the Maidan events of February 2022, as we all know, they have always and consistently insisted that Crimea, Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kherson, these are Ukrainian territories. Ukrainian must have them all back and must recapture them either through peaceful means, by Russian surrender, or by conquest, so that Ukraine regains all the territory that it had when it became independent in 1991. That is what the current Ukrainian government says, and at a minimum, Peskov is saying that Russia cannot coexist with a government in Kiev that has that objective. So that means, of necessity, that the Russians, at the very least, are now aiming for regime change in Kiev. But if TASS is translating this interview correctly, the interview that Peskov has given, then you can actually see that his words go beyond this meaning. He's not just talking about regime change in Kiev. He is saying that Russia cannot allow the existence of a state that has documented its intention to use any means necessary to take Crimea, not to mention Donbass and Novorossiya. A state that appears to call into question Ukraine's statehood as currently constituted. Now, on the regime change issue, a couple of days ago, I think it was about a week ago, I said that certain words that Putin had given over the course of a government meeting made it quite clear that, as far as Putin is concerned, regime change in Ukraine is now the intention. He's referred to the government in Kiev, the Ukrainian government, as the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. And as I said at the time, it is inconceivable that Putin would ever agree to negotiate with a government that he describes in that way, or that he would be prepared to recognize its existence or at least tolerate its further existence. Labeling the government in Kiev, referencing it by that label, makes its survival, or rather its destruction from a Russian point of view, an absolute existential necessity. Anyone who knows Russia at all and is familiar with Russian experiences during the Second World War would understand this. But Peskov is going beyond that, because one could, in theory, imagine a peace agreement in which there is a reconstitution of the government in Kiev and a new government takes office, which Putin accepts is a legitimate government. It doesn't have the ideological underpinnings that the existing government does, and the Russians can accept and live with it. But Peskov is now talking about Russia not allowing the existence, cannot allow the existence of a state that has documented its intention to use any means necessary to take Crimea, not to mention Donbass and Novorossiya. And given that there must be some people saying in Moscow that any Ukrainian state, at any rate, any Ukrainian state based in Kiev, sooner or later is all but certain, if allowed to survive, to reclaim control of Crimea, Donbass, and Novorossiya, given that there are surely people like that making that very point in Moscow now. We know one of them, Dmitry Medvedev, talks about this frequently and openly. We can see that Putin, remember Peskov is Putin's spokesman, is gradually, step by step, shifting towards the position of these hardliners, who are basically saying that Russia cannot coexist with any state in Ukraine at all, at least a state in Ukraine anchored in Kiev and in control of the central regions of Ukraine, which were previously part, first of the Russian Empire and then of the Soviet Union. So that already looks to me pretty momentous. We've had comments of this kind from Russian officials in the past. As I said, Medvedev makes them all the time. But this is the nearest to a comment of that nature from Putin himself that we have seen up to this point. Note again, Peskov is Putin's spokesman, and he speaks for Putin on this matter. And then, of course, we get to what might be referred to as the Freudian slip. The comment that Peskov made about Russia being at war. This is the one that has attracted far and away the most attention, but we've had a correction, or at least a purported correction, about this from the Kremlin, indeed from Peskov himself. Peskov has said that his words about war were misconstrued. He didn't quite mean it in the way that people are saying. And what Peskov has said basically is that he didn't actually say that Russia is at war with Ukraine de jure, legally. He is just engaging in a form of speech when he a manner of speaking when he talked about at war. This is what Peskov is reported to have said. Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov has said that his words about the special military operation being turned into a war does not mean a state of war de jure, that is to say, legally speaking. Asked to clarify whether his previous statement about the special military operation being turned into a war changed the status of this conflict, Peskov said, essentially, the moment the collective West entered the conflict, it turned it into a war for us. This does not imply any legal changes. It is still a special military operation legally. But de facto, in fact, it has turned into a war for us as the collective West increasingly and more directly enhances its involvement in the conflict. Putin warned, and then we're told by Peskov, warned against comparing his use of the word war with what the participants in the protests against the special operation mean by it. This is an utterly inappropriate comparison because their context is different from mine. The word war is used in different contexts. This is absolutely so. You just compare what context I have and what context is present in the slogans of the operation's opponents. Well, if that all sounds very confusing, it is because it is. And in fact, I think that obviously there was a slip. I don't think Peskov actually intended over the course of this interview to slip from use of the word special military operation to war. Perhaps he meant that the West was waging a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, which is absolutely true and which no one denies. But you see that here he's going to extreme lengths to deny that Ukraine and Russia are actually in a formal legal state of war with each other. But I refer to this also as a Freudian slip because there is a possible context to this slip of Peskov's, which is important. And that is that, and for that we have to go back to his other comments. His comment that all of the four regions, all the territory of the four regions of the Donbass, Zaporozhye, and Kherson must be completely liberated and brought under Moscow's control. And secondly, that Russia cannot tolerate the existence of a state that threatens Crimea, Donbass, and what the Russians now refer to as Novorossiya. I explained that in order to achieve the last, to ensure that there is no state that threatens Russian control over these territories, the Russians, at a minimum, need to achieve regime change in Kiev, but that Peskov's words could be extended to mean that there is now a question mark over the continued existence of the existing state of Ukraine. Well, if changes of that extremely radical nature are to be effected by Russia, if there is to be regime change in Kiev, or alternatively, a dismantling of the existing Ukrainian state as we know it, then that is incompatible, inconsistent with a limited special military operation. It is something which, legally speaking, could only be done through a war. And of course, when Peskov says that this is a war which the Western powers have brought about through their escalatory action and their support for Ukraine, he is in effect shifting the blame for that war from Russia to the Western powers so as to give the Russians a defense against any charge that they're actually, in the event that it does become a war, waging a war of aggression. I wonder whether what has happened here is that Peskov slipped out more than he intended, and that there have in fact been debates within the Kremlin about how to move forward with this objective of either regime change in Kiev or the dismantling of the existing Ukrainian state, whether the Russians haven't been advised, the Kremlin hasn't been advised by its very skilled and erudite legal advisors that the only way that this can be done legally, and note that the Russians are painstaking in dotting the I's and crossing the T's, legally speaking, on anything they do, that the only way that this can be done legally is by moving from a state of a special military operation to a state of outright war, and that in order to justify that war and to prevent it from being seen as a war of aggression, the Russians must shift the blame upon the West. So, all of that gives us a clue to the direction in which the Russians may be moving. They look to me to be moving increasingly towards a perspective whereby regime change in Kiev is now, at the very least, the objective, but also a possible further objective, which is the complete dismantling of the entire Ukrainian state, at least as we have known it. So, massive revelations. As I said, other Russian officials have spoken in this way before. Indeed, way back in the autumn, we were getting a whole succession of statements from all sorts of Russian officials, the Speaker of the Duma, Volodin, Lavrov to a certain extent, Medvedev, obviously, Matveyenko, the Speaker of the Federation Council, the upper house of the Russian Parliament. They're all talking, as I remember at that time, about the fact that the only way the war could end would be with Ukraine's complete capitulation. Putin has always been more restrained. He's always appeared to leave the door open towards negotiation. But I think that Peskov, perhaps unintentionally, has pulled the curtain a bit aside, and we can see the kind of debates that are now perhaps taking place behind the walls of the Kremlin, and we can see that gradually, steadily, the Russians are shifting towards a much more radical position, one where they acknowledge that they are in a war, one in which they blame the West for the war and say that they're not committing aggression, but responding to aggression committed against themselves, and also one in which they set their objective at a minimum, regime change in Kiev, at a maximum, a dismantling of the current Ukrainian state, and the absorption, presumably, of further territories beyond the four regions, including, doubtless, Kharkiv region, but possibly Kiev and central Ukraine as well, into Russia. So, momentous words, important words, and it is important also that we remember them. So, dramatic news on that front. We've also had further dramatic news from the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. And this report has, again, attracted a huge amount of attention, and it comes from the Russian Defense Ministry. And Shoigu, as he regularly does, has been touring a number of factories in Nizhny Tagil. This is a major industrial city on the Volga. I should say my wife has visited it, and she's described it to me extensively. It is where, by the way, the famous gas, or at least in Russia they're famous, the gas trucks and motor cars. Well, the motor cars have been discontinued, but the trucks are built. It's a big auto factory. Some people used to, and once upon a time, refer to Nizhny Novgorod as Russia's Detroit. It's never really true, but never mind. But anyway, it's a major industrial center. It used to be called Gorky, after the Russian writer Maxim Gorky. This was during the Soviet era. Many probably still remember that for a certain period of his life, the dissident Soviet scientist Andrei Sakharov was exiled there, together with his wife, Yelena Bonner. But anyway, it is a major industrial center with large numbers of enterprises, military industrial enterprises located there, including, by the way, a shipyard, which I understand builds submarines. I mean, it sounds astonishing that a city deep in the hinterland of Russia has a shipyard that builds conventional diesel-electric submarines for the Russian fleet. But apparently there is such a shipyard there. And as I've discussed many times, Russia's incredibly complex river and canal system, painstakingly developed during the time of Joseph Stalin, actually makes that possible, because you can build a submarine far in the interior of Russia and it can float up the rivers and canals and reach the seashores where it is intended to operate. And if you've seen Russian rivers, as I have done, rivers like the Volga and the Kama, well, you understand from seeing the size of these rivers why that is possible. But anyway, enough of that. Let's move on and discuss what happened when Shoigu visited Nizhny Novgorod. And we have a photographic pictures of Shoigu meeting factory workers and looking at shop floors and inspecting equipment. But anyway, this is the report. Russian Defense Minister, General of the Army Sergei Shoigu, inspected fulfillment of state defense order at defense industry enterprises in Nizhny Novgorod region. So he's visited, as we will see, 2 factories. And we start with this one. At the enterprise, the Russian Defense Minister inspected the production of air-delivered ordnance, as well as artillery and tank shells of various calibers. Now, I should say that Nizhny Tagil, amongst the many big factories located there, has a factory which used to build MiG fighter jets. I think it perhaps still does. It still produces fighter jets, but this is again an area where production of equipment for the Air Force, unsurprisingly, is well established. And then the report goes on to say the Director General of the enterprise, and notice that we're not told the name of the enterprise or of the director, reported to General of the Army Shoigu that the enterprise is fully fulfilling the state defense order, and since the beginning of the year, the output has increased significantly. Shoigu was informed that the enterprise has repeatedly increased the production of FAB-500 aerial bombs, double the production of FAB-1500 aerial bombs, and since February of this year, mass production of FAB-3000 aerial bombs has been established. Now, this is the part of this report which has attracted, deservedly, the most attention, because we have seen the Russians use FAB-250, FAB-500, and since the start of this year, FAB-1500 precision-guided aerial glide bombs to absolutely devastating effect in the battles of Donbass. They were used massively in the Avdiivka area. They're being used massively around Chasov Yar, even as I'm making this program. The Russians have also carried out huge bombing raids on the western shore, on the west bank of the Dnieper, in Kherson region. One of the great changes over the course of the last few months is the arrival of the Russian Air Force with these devastating bombs in the skies over Ukraine. And of course, up to now, the biggest and most powerful aerial bomb that the Russians have been using over the Ukrainian battlefronts is the FAB-1500. The FAB-3000, which we're told entered series production in February, and which we will probably see being used in action at some point over the next few weeks, is double its size. I understand that it holds an explosive charge of around 1.5 tons, 1,500 kilos. That's the explosive charge. Now, for comparison, a 155 millimeter shell has an explosive charge of just 7 kilos. Now, Jeff Roberts, the historian who does an absolutely outstanding service to all of us who try to follow the war. Anyway, he does this. He provides us with links to all sorts of articles which discuss at length various aspects of the conflict in Ukraine. And he recently provided us, all those of us who are fortunate enough to be at the receiving end of these links, he's provided us with information about, an article about the use by Russia of aerial bombs and, in fact, the nature of these bombs. And it makes very interesting reading, because it turns out that these bombs are indeed as powerful as we all assume, but it is a misconception to think that FAB-3000s are going to be necessarily more useful in every situation than the smaller bombs. Now, this article, which is entitled Renaissance of the Bomb, Gliding Fabs by Mike Mikhailovich, and which is published on the 10th of March, makes the point that Ukraine has no real counter to these aerial bombs, that they present a challenge for Ukraine that there isn't really a proper response to, that the Russian aircraft are able to launch these huge bombs from beyond the range of Ukrainian air defenses. The article explains in great detail the ingenuity with which the Russians have adapted these bombs, converted older Soviet bombs, unguided bombs, into guided bombs. Note, however, that Shoigu was told at the factory that these are new production bombs, so maybe they're also producing new production bombs as well. But anyway, we provided with a lot of information about the kit. The author explains that the kit, to a Western eye, seems crude and simple and very cheap. People always say that about whatever the Russians do, that it looks crude and simple and is very cheap. But it has been devastatingly effective. And that is, I think, something which no one would dispute. And for the record, I don't myself see that there's been any real change, any real difference between the effectiveness of these Russian bombs and their accuracy than comparable, much more expensive Western bombs. And by the way, and for the record, my own understanding is that Western bombs tend to be smaller and carry less explosive than Russian ones, though I might be wrong about that. But anyway, but he does make a point, the author does also make a point, that it's a misconception to think that the bigger the bomb, the more effective it necessarily is. And the article contains this paragraph. There is no doubt that 6 FAB-500 bombs with precision guidance in most scenarios will cause more damage to the enemy than 1 FAB-3000 bomb with precision guidance. There is no doubt that 6 FAB-3000s will inflict more damage on the enemy than 6 FAB-500 bombs. Well, that's obvious, but note that you'll inflict more damage, all things being equal, by dropping 6 500-kilo bombs as opposed to 1 much bigger 3,000-kilo bomb. And the point is that one may ask why Russia isn't using even bigger bombs. And the point is that it's partly due to the number of bombs that the aircraft can carry. And secondly, a bomb strike is that a bomb strike involving a number of bombs has a bigger area of impact than a single bomb does. But of course, there is an important exception, because if you are looking to smash particular structures, bunkers, fortified pillboxes, things of that kind, then obviously the bigger, more powerful, the heavier the bomb is that you drop, the more damage it's going to do to that structure. So one can see why you need FAB-250s and FAB-500s alongside the bigger bombs, the FAB-1500 and the FAB-3000. But the FAB-3000s, though they will not be used in the same quantities as the lighter bombs, will be absolutely devastating in smashing Ukrainian fortified positions. Now, I've been doing a few basic checks about carrier aircraft. The most likely carrier aircraft for the FAB-3000 will presumably be the Sukhoi 34 fighter bomber, which is the major fighter bomber that the Russians use in this conflict. It's one of the most potent fighter bombing aircraft in the world, as far as I can see. The Sukhoi 34 can carry a nominal load of 14 tons, 14,000 kilos, distributed across all of its hard points, but it is limited to a weight of 4,000 kilos on any one hard point. So I'm going to guess that a Sukhoi 34 can carry a maximum of 2 FAB-3000 bombs, and it's probably also limited, by the way, to carrying a maximum of 2 FAB-1500 bombs, whereas it can no doubt carry significantly more FAB-500s and FAB-250s. So that gives you a sense of the kind of use that the Russians might make of these bombs. For the much bigger bombs that the Russians also have, the FAB-9000s, for example, 9-ton bombs. I mean, imagine the power of one of those. Well, you would need a bigger strategic aircraft like a Tupolev 22M3. They would be too heavy for the Sukhoi 34s, which are the aircraft currently being used on the battlefronts. So, the Russians, they've done massive damage with the bombs that they have already been using. Now they are unrolling and going to be deploying on the battlefronts a bomb, the FAB-3000, which is more powerful than any of the other bombs they've used up to this time. But Shoigu's visit was not only so that he could be updated about the situation with bombs, because it turns out that this factory and the other factory that he visited are also involved in artillery shell production as well. And going back to the report, this is what it says. The range of artillery ammunition produced at the plant which makes the bombs, has also been increased. Since last year, the enterprise's production of modern artillery and aviation weaponry has increased fivefold over the last year. Such results have been achieved thanks to the enterprise's reactivating production capabilities, technical re-equipment and modernization of production lines for the manufacture of projectiles by modern high-tech equipment. Now, I've said this many times, Russian factories of this sort are enormous. They're designed to have spare capacity. We are told that the surge in production has been achieved by reactivating some of that production capability, and it's also been facilitated by substantial modernization. And we read, since 2022, the plant has been reconstructed, modernized, and more than 45,000 square meters of production space have been put into service. 45,000 square meters. This is new production in one factory. That is a very big factory, can I just say? We're talking about an enormous factory. Someone like, well, Jim Kinnair perhaps, can probably make a pretty shrewd guess as to which factory this is. But we're talking about a huge factory here. Anyway, he then goes on to say this. The company noted that most of the plant sections work around the clock on a 3-shift working schedule, in other words, 24 hours a day, workers each working an 8-hour shift. The total number of employees at the enterprise has increased by more than 1,100 since 2022. 1,000 additional workers at one factory. Again, you need to know something about industry and industrial production to know what an enormous increase in employee manpower that is. And it looks as if these are skilled workers. And we are told that at the same time, the wage rates, salaries, and employee bonuses have been increased so that on average, the salary at the factory has gone up by 20%. Also, the Russian defense minister inspected the production of artillery ammunition at the defense industry enterprise that manufactures the repairs ammunition for the Gyatsinsk artillery system. So this is a completely different factory. We're now talking about a second factory. And again, checking this out in Jim Kinnair's indispensable book, it turns out that the Gyazinth, which we see being referred to here, is an artillery piece. It's a very powerful gun of 152 millimeters. Anyway, we then go on to read that the company's head, again, notice we're not given the name of the company or the name of the director, reported to Shoigu on the expansion of the plant's production capabilities, where the repair and technical equipping of the shell repair facility were carried out, along with the installation of new equipment at the ammunition manufacturing workshop for 122 millimeter and 152 millimeter artillery shell systems. Now notice that we are told that there is a shell repair facility. So it looks as if this factory is involved both in manufacturing new shells, but also in refurbishing old ones taken out of stockpile. And then we're told that a new ammunition assembly workshop has been built at the enterprise. In addition, it is planned to create new storage facilities for artillery shells. So there's going to be an expansion of current production of shells. This is production of new shells with new storage. So that's what we're told about new production. Following the results of the work, the Russian defense minister held a working meeting with the participation of the leadership of the Russian Defense Ministry, representatives of the relevant military authorities, and heads of enterprises. The defense minister noted that enterprises have undergone serious changes since the previous inspection. When it comes to production of artillery ammunition, the volume of artillery ammunition components has increased by almost 22-fold. Now, we're not told what these components are, and we're not told what the base figure is or what the start point is. But the guess is that 22-fold since 2022. Now, we're told that the volume of artillery ammunition components has been increased by almost 22-fold, not shells. So it's important to make that distinction. And then we're told that 75% of military ammunition components are recovered. Now, that is very unclear what that means, but perhaps this refers to refurbishment of shells, or perhaps the taking of components from old shells so as to make it easier to produce new ones. Just saying. And this, we're told that this means that this allows us to maintain a sufficient level of supply of projectiles to the Special Military Operations Zone. The tasks we set a year ago have been accomplished, new facilities have been built, and they work at full capacity, said Shoigu. And Shoigu emphasized that the tasks to expand production capability by enterprises had previously been set. When the new facilities began operation, the production volume actually increased by almost 2.5 times. This is what Shoigu says, but we don't know when these facilities came on stream. I get the sense we're looking at the start of this year, just saying. The defense minister noted that by commissioning new facilities, enterprises are working ahead of the production schedule. We're looking forward to an increase in production in the third quarter. We did so already after the first quarter was already completed, was actually completed. So it looks like January, February, March has already achieved, the Russians have already achieved their targets for shell production for the first 8 months of the year. just saying. And the report concludes, the work is enormous. The enterprise is not just reconstructed and modernized. It is a new enterprise in many ways. This is a great achievement of those who work at enterprises 3 shifts a week. Such are the times we live in, so thank you for it. Again, I suspect that Jim Kinnair could probably figure out quite shrewdly which other enterprise Shoigu is talking about. So, huge surges in production, massive increase in shell production. We see the Russians trundling out FAB-3000s in February, and we're again given a peek as to the enormous increases in volumes of artillery shell production as well, with two factories in the Nizhny Novgorod area now working on producing shells, as well as, in the case of one, bombs. And one of those factories apparently also involved in refurbishing old shells or taking components from old shells and using them to increase production of new shells. So big increases in shell production, big increases in factory capacity. The Russian military economy is whirring ahead. At least that is what this report suggests to us, and it is also what we are seeing on the battlefronts. Now, yesterday, I talked about a massive Russian missile strike on Kiev, and the report suggests it was huge, and it was very much centered on Kiev. The Russian Defense Ministry said that it included decision-making centers. It was a very complex operation, bringing together both subsonic cruise missiles, but also, as it turns out, Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. As far as I could see, the air defense systems in Kiev were barely operating. The Ukrainians make all kinds of inconsistent claims about this, but all the film that I've seen from Kiev is consistent with a missile strike being conducted over several hours of the night with barely any significant opposition. And in my program yesterday, I also said that I did wonder whether the reference to decision-making centers might point to the Russians hunting for Kirilo Budanov. And sure enough, today, there were reports that the primary target of this gigantic missile strike launched by the Russians on Kiev was Ukraine's military intelligence, the organization that Budanov heads, with the Russians perhaps hoping that, well, if one of their missiles hit Budanov, let's say they wouldn't be too sorry. And it's not difficult to understand why the Russians might be interested in targeting Budanov and Ukraine's military intelligence. Budanov has orchestrated these attacks on the border villages in Belgorod and Kursk. He seems to have come up with an appalling plan to try to seize a nuclear weapons facility in Belgorod region. That's what my sources are telling me, and they're reliable. The Russians will have concluded that he and the organization he heads are incredibly dangerous people, and they will be looking to degrade them as much as they can and to scare them off as much as they can. And as I said, if they reach Budanov himself over the course of these strikes, well, they won't be sorry. Anyway, that was the attack that took place a day and a night ago. Last night, we had an even bigger missile strike. I think the biggest we've seen, certainly for many months. I think it might have been the biggest of all that we have seen over the course of this war. According to Zelensky, the Russians launched 60 drones, Duran 2 drones, and 90 missiles. And as is now consistent with the way in which the Russians operate, there were lots of different missiles being used. Now, last night, we did not get reports of Kinzhal hypersonic missiles being used, but it appears to have been an incredibly complex and very sophisticated operation, including missile strikes using ground-based Iskander ballistic missiles, KH-101 cruise missiles launched from aircraft, bombers, heavy bombers of the Russian Air Force operating over the Caspian Sea. It seems that it also included these enormous KH-22, 32 giant anti-ship missiles, supersonic anti-ship missiles that the Russians designed back in the 1960s to destroy US Navy carriers, but which have proved to be a formidable land attack force when used by the Russians, as they have been using them in Ukraine. And it's clear that this time the major target was the Ukrainian energy system. Now, the Russians have not targeted Ukraine's energy system this winter. They have launched massive missile strikes against Ukraine since the start of the year, but these have been focused more on military, industrial warehouses, ammunition dumps, all those sort of things. This strike, on this occasion, targeted Ukraine's energy system. And it was devastating. Its effect has been devastating. Power cuts and shortages across Ukraine. The internet apparently crashed, stopped working. Problems with the railways. And of course, a huge amount of speculation as to what this strike is all about. It's been suggested that the Russians are repeating what they did last year. The Russians are attacking the energy system because they know the Ukrainians have no alternative but to defend it, and that will force them to pull their air defense assets back from the front lines to try to defend the energy facilities. The energy facilities seem to have been almost entirely undefended as a result of this latest strike. Pulling back the air defense assets will leave the front lines exposed, and the Russian bombers equipped with the heavy bombs, including before long the FAB-3000s, can then operate at will. And in the meantime, of course, as the Ukrainians struggle to shoot down more and more Russian cruise missiles and drones, their air defense assets already, we're told, almost at breaking point, become depleted. Now, for all I know, that is true. And I think there may be an element of this, but I suspect, and I go back now to what Helmer said in Dances with Bears, his indispensable website, back in 2022, when the missile strikes against the energy system first began, that one of the things the Russians were doing was working out how the energy system worked, identifying its weak spots so as to prepare for the final destruction of the energy system in conjunction with the big Russian offensive when it was finally launched, which could be perhaps sometime in the summer. The point being that if the energy system breaks down, Ukraine can't move trains. In Ukraine, trains operate on electric traction. The entire logistical operation in Ukraine begins to break down, and that facilitates Russia's ability to press home its offensive. I should say that one of my sources some months ago explained that as well as depleting Ukraine's air defense system last year through the attacks on the energy system, the attacks on the energy system caused enough disruption to the railway system so as to enable the Russians to press forward with construction of the Surovikin line, that the Ukrainians were not able to press home their offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region in the way that they would otherwise have done. And that gave the Russians more time and space to build up their defenses and build up their reserves in the Surovikin line and elsewhere. So it could be, and this tallies with what Helmut also said, that is also part of the plan. But anyway, this looks like it's a massive strike. And again, the big story is the lack of any air defense, any successful air defense to try to parry it. And of course, as I've been discussing in many programs recently, Ukraine's air defense assets are already, as of this time, critically depleted, not just by the need to launch missiles to shoot down Russian missiles, but because the decision by Ukraine to forward base air defense systems on the combat line to provide at least some protection to Ukrainian troops against Russian bombing has enabled the Russians to hunt and destroy large numbers of S-300 and Patriot anti-defense missile systems, air defense missile systems, including, according to Shoigu, what he said a few days ago, 5 Patriot missile systems since the start of this year. Anyway, we see the hammer falling, and Shoigu reported to the Russian Defense Ministry a few days ago that Ukrainian losses this year, in the first 10 weeks of this year, stand at 71,000 men, treble the amount of Ukrainian losses during the same period last year. And I saw a report somewhere, forget where, that a Ukrainian soldier has come forward and said exactly the same thing, that Ukrainian losses in the first weeks of this year have been at 3 times the level that they were at this time last year. This time last year, losses already being extremely heavy during the bitter and terrible battle of Bakhmut, which was being fought then. So we see how Russia's military industrial capacity, its ability to churn out more guns, more bombs, more shells, more drones, is starting to have an absolutely overwhelming impact on the battlefields. And, well, we are also now getting reports from the battlefields, and they are terrible. Firstly, if we go back, terrible for Ukraine, if we go back to what we know from the battlefields, firstly, Avdiivka. Yesterday, I said that Tonenka, the second village on the defense line, alongside Orlovka, has now fallen. There's apparently been photographic evidence which puts Russian troops now well to the west of Tonenka. It looks like Ukrainian defenses in the area southwest of Avdiivka are starting to collapse, opening up perhaps the way for the Russians to finish off the fighting in Pervomaisky, this town to the southwest of Avdiivka. The Ukrainians still cling on to Berdichi in the north, but with Orlovka having fallen and with Russian troops moving on towards Berdichi from the south as well as from the east, this looks like a hopeless enterprise. And it makes, to my mind, less and less sense that the Ukrainians should continue to try to defend themselves in Berdichi. We are, by the way, getting also further reports of a big Russian breakthrough in the Bakhmut area. Again, I'm going now to Dima at the Military Summary channel. He's spoken at enormous length and no doubt entirely accurately, in fact, I've no doubt about this at all, about the importance of a hill that the Ukrainians controlled to the northwest of Ivanivska, Krasnoye as the Russians call it, this important village that the Russians need to capture on the way to Chasiv Yar. Well, apparently we've now had photographic evidence this morning that the Russians have now captured this hill, which looks like it is the coup de grace, the final event that is going to lead to the fall, the final fall of Ivanivska and the opening up of the way for the Russians to move on to Chasiv Yar. And already, by the way, we're getting reports that the Ukrainians are retreating to the south of Ivanivska. Their forces that were trying to hold out in Klishevka and Andreevka are apparently pulling back. The Russians have captured an important railway station there. It looks to me as if the Ukrainian defense line west of Bakhmut is starting to collapse under the weight of Russian shelling and Russian bombing, just as the defense lines in Avdiivka collapsed back in February. And, well, there's lots of other news from the battlefronts as well. There was claims by our old friend Vladimir Rogov yesterday that the Russians now control the whole of Rabotino, south and central of Rabotino, except for some buildings apparently to the northeast of Rabotino, where the Ukrainians are still clinging on. But Rogov went on to say that the Russians are now starting to push forward and are clearing that part of Rabotino as well. And, well, I found myself on the topic of Rabotino and the area of Bradley Square, this territory the Ukrainians carved out east of Rabotino during the summer offensive. I find myself being agreed with by, of all places, the New York Times. They've now published a very interesting article in which, just as I have done, they ask, what is the sense of Ukraine trying to defend its positions in Rabotino and Bradley Square? This was territory that Ukraine captured, a horrific loss during its offensive in the summer. It proved of no use to Ukraine at all. It has created a salient in which the Ukrainians are surrounded on three sides by the Russians. The Russians control the high ground. The Ukrainians are outgunned and outbombed. They're suffering appalling losses in trying to cling on to this useless territory. It makes much more sense for them to pull back. And I've thought that all along. I've asked the question in previous programs, what exactly is it that the Ukrainians think they are doing in this area of Rabotino and Bradley Square? And sure enough, it turns out that there are people in the United States, people who have discussed the fighting in Rabotino, in Bradley Square, with the New York Times, who are asking the same question, who are urging the Ukrainians to retreat from this useless ground. There are apparently Ukrainian soldiers who are saying the same thing. And the riposte that is coming from Ukrainian officials is the same as always. They cannot retreat from these undefendable positions, because if they did, that would act as a further blow to Ukrainian morale. In other words, it is a prestige issue. We saw that Zelensky, no less, visited or claimed to visit Rabotino some weeks ago, making it clear that the place must be defended at all costs. And, well, the Ukrainians are doing that very thing, even though their American advisors don't understand why they're doing it, and nor do I. Anyway, bad situation there, bad situation in Avdiivka and Georgievka and Pervomaisky and Bakhmut. Bad situation also, so I understand, near the village of Terny on the Zherebets River. The Russians have now, to all intents and purposes, from what I can tell, taken Terny, this tiny village, about 500 people, as I understand it, before the conflict. They've taken this village into a kind of semicircle. Ukrainian troops who are defending themselves there must be all but trapped, I would have thought. But anyway, there we are. Fighting going on there. Terny almost certain to fall soon. And, well, the build-up, the Russian build-up goes on. It continues. It gets stronger. The Russians getting stronger all the time. The difference discernible day after day. The Ukrainians suffering losses day after day. They're being ground down exactly as General Surovikin, when in the short period when he was the Russian commander, way back in October 2022, said they would be. And that is what we're seeing. And no one seems able, either in Kiev or in the West, to say stop. The Ukrainians, I discussed yesterday, their astonishing rudeness towards the Chinese, towards Li Hui, who's counseling them to seek some kind of compromise peace with the Russians. Apparently that is unacceptable. The Ukrainians rude, unnecessarily rude, to a party that in truth is only seeking to help them. And Western governments also completely at sea about what they're going to do. So we've had Josep Borrell ruling out the sending of Western troops to Ukraine. He said that really isn't an option. The Germans are, to all intents and purposes, doing the same. They're not even going to supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Or perhaps I should rephrase that. Thank heavens they are not supplying Taurus missiles to Ukraine, but they're not going to send troops either. And it's clear that they are coming to the limit of their abilities about what kind of military support they can provide to Ukraine. The British, well past the point when they can supply anything substantive to Ukraine. Well, they're still providing some Storm Shadow missiles and help with guidance and perhaps water drones as well. But even here, there's been an awful lot written and said over the last few weeks about Ukrainian success, real or fictional, in sinking Russian warships in the Black Sea. But over the last couple of days, the Russians have been working at an accelerated pace, destroying Ukrainian shipping on the Dnieper River. And every day now we're getting pictures of Ukrainian ships and boats and water vessels being destroyed by Russian missile and airstrikes and drone strikes. I noticed that the media in the West tells us very little about any of that. Maybe these are not big warships like the Russian ones are. Maybe they're not even warships. But the fact is they are assets, seaborne assets, and Ukraine is losing them. Anyway, British exhausted in what they can do. The Americans largely exhausted as well. There's an interesting article in The Hill which suggests that the conflict in Congress about the $61 billion appropriation is very, very far from resolved. That Speaker Johnson probably would like to see some funding sent to Ukraine, but he understands that his base and House Republicans have strong feelings about this issue, and he's had to weigh that against his own feelings and the pressure he's getting from the administration. There's been attempts by certain Democrats to come up with complex parliamentary procedures to override Speaker Johnson's decision, but so far as I can see, so far only Democrats are supporting those moves, not Republicans. There's the Republican plan to convert at least some of the funding from a appropriation into a loan. I discussed this all yesterday at some length, but it seems even that is at an early stage, and the discussions anyway have been postponed to the second half of April. So nothing much coming from the United States either. There's a universal shortage in the West of air defense missiles. And without air defense missiles, how is Ukraine going to withstand the bombs and the missiles that the Russians hurl against them? The F-16s not due to appear until June at the earliest, and only in tiny numbers, and they're probably not a match to Russian Air Force fighters anyway. And anyway, the overall picture, incredibly gloomy and bad for Ukraine. Apparently, there's a report which has appeared in the French edition of Politico, which says that Macron told French party leaders over lunch that there's a real possibility that Ukraine could collapse very soon. I don't think this is true. I think there is still quite a lot of fighting still to go. I get the sense that the Russians probably don't see the end of this conflict prior to the last months of this year, or perhaps next year, just saying. But putting all the facts together, one can start to see why Macron might be beginning to think in that way, whether that's had any bearing on his recent proclamations about sending French troops to Ukraine. I don't know. Perhaps it has. The deputy speaker of the Duma, Pyotr Tolstoy, who is, I believe, related in some way to the Russian writer Lev Tolstoy. Anyway, he has actually been on French television and has made crystal clear to the French people directly that if their troops do go to Ukraine, the Russians will target them. I don't think that's going to happen. So one way or the other, a complete bankruptcy and failure of policy, even as this juggernaut, this Russian juggernaut, trundles westwards. We see from Peskov where all this could lead, to the end of Ukraine in the form that we have known it. Now, there are some people watching this program who will not be sorry if that happens. All I will say about that is that I find no pleasure in this, and one way or the other, it seems extraordinary to me that we could be at such a point when such an outcome was so easily avoided over such a long time. Well, this is where I end my program today. I hope to discuss in my next program the latest moves towards a ceasefire in Gaza. I think they are for real, by the way. That doesn't mean that a ceasefire is actually going to happen. I mean, the intentions to get some kind of a ceasefire are for real, but there's an awful lot of pieces still that need to be lined up But in the meantime, I'm going to finish this program here today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. You'll find all sorts of wonderful items there, celebrating Greek Independence Day. Back in the 19th century, Greece, after a terrible war, fought throughout the 1820s, gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire, largely, by the way, through the work of the Greeks themselves, but also with an indispensable contribution from the Russians, who went to war with Turkey on Greece's behalf, a fact which the current Prime Minister of Greece, Mr. Mitsotakis, appears to have forgotten. But anyway, I'm not going to get drawn into all of that now, but you can find all of these items there on our shop. And in the meantime, let me remind you again that if you've liked this video, you can tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.